ladies and gentlemen, I now may come to the subject matter itself, which is linking what I have to say about the drama of humanity to the contemporary situation. Now, the first thing that is perhaps unusual, if it is used as a technical term, is to speak of a drama of humanity and not of a drama of man. We will presently see why. There's an important difference. But it gives us a starting point. I have to be clear about it, or we have to be clear about it. What is the present conception of man in a public sense? We must always distinguish between the dealings which a few specialist scholars or philosophers have with such problems and what is generally accepted and generally known. And I want to give therefore first, simply enumerating the terms in which popularly modern man is characterized in a general topical fashion, and then in opposition formulate how the same features have to be characterized from a critical position. You will then see best by this mere enumeration of categories that there is a wide gap between the accepted conceptions, publicly accepted, and what is done today in philosophy. Now, when we speak of modern man and use the self-characterization of him in the society in which we all live as modern man, you will find such terms as, first of course, the term modern man, then frequently used, peculiarly modern is to be a secular man, then very much into fashion has come, especially beginning with Toynbee, the idea that modern man is living in a post-Christian age and therefore a post-Christian man, and if the matter gets some sort of philosophical polish, you will then call that post-Christian man an immanentist or world immanent man. So these are the most usual terms in which we speak about man if we want to characterize him as a modern man. And of course modern man is living in an age. Everything that's elegant lives in an age, and so we also have to live in an age, it's modern or something like that, and we'll see then what it is. Now these are the terms of self-characterization. If we now use critical, empirical and philosophical vocabulary to characterize the same situation, we would have to say that the modern man who is intended by these more or less cliché terms is, in the first place, a fundamentalist. In the second place, he is illiterate. In the third place, he is burning with apocalyptic fire and therefore torn between being frightened by the world and full of expectation that something will become better. So this ambivalence of attitude of being frightened and expectant at the same time, that is what usually is called then, again by a general term, alienation, an alienated man. So, these three characteristics, now I have to explain a bit in detail. The fundamentalist, the illiterate, and the apocalyptic characteristic. Just let me say in some, frequently there has been used also, in order to characterize this peculiar compound, a term used by a German theologian who became a victim of Hitler, by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He calls this combination, man has come of age. These three items. Now let me elaborate that. I said the first characteristic is the dogmatism, the fundamentalism. The fundamentalism is meant a peculiarity of our modern civilization which already starts in the 16th century. The great war periods of the West since the 16th century are intellectual war periods in the sense of wars among dogmas. Let's call them briefly dogmatomachis. Fights among dogmas. In the 18th century, 16th century, there were the religious fights between various types of dogmatic theologies. In the 20th century, there have become the great fights between various dogmatic ideologies. So we have a series of dogmas crystallizing since the 16th century roughly the three which have entered into the Kantian philosophy of history. We begin with a theological dogma, that is then followed by a metaphysical dogma, and the metaphysical dogma then by an ideological dogma. So there's a series of three dogmas. As soon as we get out of one, we fall into the next, and at present we are still living in the ideological dogma, as far as there are not preserved theological dogmas or the metaphysical dogmas. Now when I speak of dogma, I do not mean what is usually called an orthodoxy, but the specific kind of literalism or fundamentalism in which of a religious attitude or of an attitude concerned with the relation between man and divinity, there is nothing left but the literalist formulation, that is a dogma, and there is no original experience of the experiences which have produced symbolism, but only the dogma itself is left. So when that situation has arrived, that only the dogma itself is left, be it theological or metaphysical or ideological, then we are in the fundamentalist situation. Now this fundamentalist situation, that's why I mentioned the whole thing, you must realize, lasts now for well over 400 years. And if anywhere we are at present, you might say, at the end of this doctrinaire fundamentalist attitude and recapturing experiences from various sources. But that is meant what I mean by fundamentalism. So fundamentalism is one of the characteristics of modern man. Now parallel with this permanently aggravating fundamentalism of dogma, we have the attempts, again since the 16th century, of recapturing experiences, original experiences, which will us get again back of the dogma into the reality of relations between man and his surrounding reality, including divine reality. Such attempts have been undertaken, for instance, in the 17th century by Descartes, and very energetically by Hegel in his Phenomenology of 1807. The introduction of Hegel's Phenomenology is an essay on the question that after the dogmatism of enlightenment, we have to have recourse to experience in order to reconstitute the understanding of man's relation to his surrounding reality, including the divine reality. One cannot simply go on with mere dogma, which as to its origins is not understood. In the 20th century, parallel with the ideological wars, we have also such typical philosophers who try to recapture experience. At the beginning of the century stands an American philosopher, I should say, William James's Does Consciousness Exist? That essay of 1804 has perhaps an importance for the 20th century comparable to the meditations of Descartes in the 16th. It is absolutely. And similar attempts to recapture experiences were made by Bergson, especially in his De Source de la Morale et de la Religion, and in the metaphysical works of Whitehead, beginning with 1924. I could mention others. For instance, I like very much the English physicist Eddington, who has given a very fine analysis of the problem experiences posed by the advance of the natural sciences. Now, this double game of an ever deeper sinking into dogmatism and fundamentalism, and more or less desperate attempts to recapture reality, the reality of experience, that goes on, as I said, for the 400 years. And it has a very peculiar consequence. And here I come now to the second characteristic, what I call the illiteracy. We have a very high degree of literacy on the level of dogma. At no other time did we have such a perfect knowledge of all sorts of religions, of comparative religions, of ancient civilizations, of religions of contemporary Asiatic civilizations, and so on, but not a very good analysis of the experiences on which they rest. So, the characteristic of illiteracy pertains to the understanding of experiences and the symbols in which they have to be expressed. For instance, there is extremely little active culture of meditation in the Christian or philosophical sense or any other sense, and of the symbolisms which rest on meditation. I have to talk about them in the second lecture then. So in that sense we have a peculiar illiteracy with regard to the most essential problems of human reality, coupled with an enormous literacy with regard to peripheral problems. That is one of the peculiarities. And that has particularly disastrous effects under Western conditions, which lead then to the third characteristic, to the apocalyptic characteristic, and that is that our whole Western civilization, as distinguished, say, from a Greek civilization or from an Egyptian civilization, is a civilization which has grown through acculturation. That is to say, it does not grow on the original basis of the older cosmic civilizations and the cosmological myths, drawing for its substance on that older plane, but it starts in on a comparatively primitive level of the Germanic tribes, taking over a highly developed civilization, the Mediterranean civilization of approximately the 4th, 5th, 6th century. And this process of acculturation is now exposed to great dangers, because if these cultural contents, which have been acquired but have not originally grown in Western civilization, get lost, there is nothing on what one can fall back, as distinguished from a Greek civilization or an Egyptian civilization. There is no archaism, for instance, possible in Western civilization, because Western civilization has no archaic period. Such a thing as, for instance, the late Egyptian period, in which one can fall back on the sculpture and art forms of the 3rd millennium BC, is impossible, because there is no 3rd millennium BC in Western civilization, and you cannot fall back on the Vikings. That is, they are just too far distant from any developed civilization. So there is no internal coherence in Western civilization from the early beginnings to the present, but when you have an acculturation process of this kind, the deculturation process, which the resultant disorder, is considerably more dangerous than periods of disorder in other civilizations which do have their connection with an original mythical order. We have nothing we can fall back on. Therefore, phenomena of alienation, which, as you will see, we find amply, for instance, around 2000 BC in the Egyptian Great Crisis, have a particular acuteness in Western civilization in our time, a sort of radical alienation, because there is nothing on which one can fall back. If certain culture contents are destroyed, there simply one has to go about it to recapture them somehow. That's one of the problems of the 20th century. That is the reason why so many people today, since we don't have a myth of our own in our civilization, will now go back to archaeology, into comparative religion, into comparative literature, and similar subject matters, because that is the place where they can recapture the substance which in our acculturated and now deculturing civilization is getting lost. That is why people become all of a sudden Zen Buddhists. It's funny, you see, but you have to become a Zen Buddhist because there is nothing comparable in Western civilization to which we can fall back if a dogmatism has run out, as the Christian has in the Age of Enlightenment. So in this sense, therefore, we have, beginning with the 19th century, a peculiar development of historical constructions in which all previous history is thrown out and a sort of original beginning is made always in the present, with the present state of consciousness, be that in the Hegelian system or the Kantian system or the Marxian system, any one of the great ideological systems of the 19th century, a sort of apocalyptic construction by which all past history is thrown out as more or less irrelevant, or having its relevance only as leading up to the present point, and from this present point that is now the modern point in which we have to live. Really on a point, throwing out all past history. That is the characteristic perhaps of the modern apocalyptic movement. One should, however, introduce a slight differentiation about which I have to talk more in the last lecture, that the great apocalyptic thinkers of the 19th century, I've just mentioned them, men like Hegel or like Kant or like Marx, still base their apocalyptic view of history on a very thorough knowledge of historical materials. So they were themselves very good historians. While today, usually, their apocalyptic position at which they resulted is taken over, but there is not taken over with it all the historical knowledge that went into its formation. And therefore you have a peculiar epigonal apocalypse in the 20th century, which results then in, for instance, an attitude of what today in Russia is called Soviet communism. A special sort of communism which is not identical with Marxism. Genuine Marxists oppose this kind of communism, and there is an internal revolt going on from the Marxists against the communists, who are the epigonal type from whom the bureaucrats are recruited, while the intellectuals would go back to Hegel and Marx because there still are the origins, the existential origins of this apocalypse to be found. So in that manner you have a peculiar epigonal dogmatism which does not even retain the older historical knowledge that still was present, say in 1830, 1840 and 50. That is also gone. So in this way you have therefore a peculiar deculturation process resulting in relegating to a realm of practical ignorance such areas of reality as are symbolized by myth, by philosophy, by revelation symbols, and by mysticism. These are the four major symbolizations of original experiences, and they, together with the original experiences, are mostly removed from the present intellectual discourse. When I say that, I'm thinking of quite concrete things. Say, for instance, in the Anglo-American area of philosophy, the dominant philosophical movement is still, you might say, British analysis, and without it being in any way critical of British analysis, if you confine your knowledge to British analysis, you have eliminated all the areas of reality symbolized by myth, philosophy, revelation, and mysticism. So practically everything that's important in life is removed if you confine yourself to the type of logical analysis, quite solid in itself. I'm a great adherent in that respect of British analysis, but confined to a type of logic which takes its model from the act of self-perception. And all these other areas are not areas of self-perception, but something entirely different. Now in this development, which I've just now characterized, you have certain outstanding milestones. You can, for instance, see the progress of this deculturation process in the change of the meaning of the term immanence from the 19th century to the 20th century. When you look at the authors in the first half of the 19th century still, at men like De Quincey or Browning or Matthew Arnold, who already worried about that problem of a God disappearing from this world. The word immanence is always used in the sense of that God somehow disappears and ceases to be immanent. That he is transcendent anyway, and in addition should be immanent. That is taken for granted. But somehow he ceases to be immanent. In that connection the term immanence appears. While today, if you read contemporary literature, you will always find that immanence is not characterized as an absence of God, but as a presence of man. That is, man is the subject of whom immanence is predicated. Man is very much immanent. That is the meaning in which the term is used now, while Browning or De Quincey or Matthew Arnold still would say that God should be immanent, and is unfortunately not immanent. So in this shift in the meaning of the term immanence in common usage in literature, you can about see how the accents have shifted from still a measure of consciousness where the problem lies, that some piece of reality is getting lost because it is no longer immanent, to, you might say, an unknowing acceptance of the loss and the statement that man is the subject of immanence. We have an immanentist man now, and not a lack of an immanentist God. So, from this position, which I just outlined, we have to distinguish between immanentist constructions of history. Man is constructed as a function of history in such philosophers of history as those of Kant, Hegel, and Marx, with an apocalyptic presence, that is a presence in which all past reality is relegated to a dead past, and all presence is concentrated in this empirical presence in time, loaded with expectation that something meaningful will come out of this presence. That is the characteristic of an apocalyptic attitude, projecting into the future and forgetting about the past, the dead past and the living future. With regard to such an opposition of a dead past with a living future, one should, for instance, be aware that these ideas of a time that flows from a past into a future on a symbolized line, just one line running to the point of present, is a conception, a meaning of the word future, which does not become current before the middle of the 18th century. Up to the middle of the 18th century, we have no term for what today always we call the future, a better future, a more peaceful future, or God knows what. This term, meaning of future, did not exist in any European language before 1750. But an entirely different one, to which I shall return presently. As against such immanentist constructions of history, now I shall develop here in these lectures a different concept of history. History is an open field of existence. Now the difference between the construction just characterized and what I shall present here can be formulated diagrammatically in the following manner. If you have this late 18th century concept of time, you would have to have something like a line of time going in this direction. Now, if you have the problem of an open time, you would have always to consider that at every point of presence on this line, we are not moving only on this line, but in openness towards divine reality. Let's say two very directions. So that every point of presence is, as T.S. Eliot formulated, a point of intersection of time with the timeless. That is a point of presence. So that the whole series of time then would not be a series on a line at all, but a series of present points in which none is ever past, but only past in relation to my present, but not really. Ontologically, really, it is always in relation to the present, which is the same present, which is my present, constitutes my present here and now. On this conception of divine presence, which is the presence in every present point on the land, depends every construction of history that makes sense, every sense of history at all. There would be no reason whatsoever why we should worry about anything that happened 3,000 years ago or 3 minutes ago, unless there were a reason perhaps, to remember it. Because it is connected with our present point 3 minutes later. Because it has a present, just as our point has a present. So a proper diagrammatical formulation would then not be the line, but you would have to make it something like a flow of present, as I call it, with a direction in which there is permanently a tension between the immanent and the transcendent poles. That would be a proper diagram of time, but not a straight line. Perhaps I should say a few words more about that, because, as I said, this line diagram of time arose in the 18th century. And already Kant had his trouble with that conception of a straight line time, because he had to ask himself, if we have such a straight line of time going in one direction and approaching a point of perfection somewhere in an indefinite future. In the indefinite future you would have that, on the one hand indefinite, on the other hand large capital perfection. That was his conception of history, approaching in an indefinite approach the realm of perfection. And then he would ask himself, how large is our perfection in any finite time in which we live, because we don't live after all infinitely, but only for a span of time. And now take any finite piece of time, make it small t, which may represent 10 years or 50 years or a century or a human lifetime, and then ask yourself the question, how large is progress within that finite time? And then you would have to formulate that this finite time is equal to the large perfection times, no, let's get it straight. The small perfection to the complete perfection is related like t to infinite, which gives you then the equation p is capital P times t by infinite, which is equal to what? 0. Definite line of time with indefinite perfection. All finite progress in time is 0. So there is an inherent logical problem. So I'm operating with the conception of a flow of presence. By the way, in order to, we have to, the third lecture where we have to deal more with these things, so I may go on with the question of time just for one step more. Maurice Merleau-Ponty has in his Phenomenologie de la Perception given a further very amusing analysis of the problem of time, because he said, time is nothing at all but a relation between myself and what I imagine to be time. And therefore, if I have such a line here now, I cannot talk about it in the abstract, but I have to place myself in relation to it. And if I imagine it to be a flow, and myself standing as a person here on the border of the river of time, then it flows past me in this direction. A flow presumably somehow ending in some sort of ocean. And therefore, all past time lies here in the future, and all future time comes back here from where you imagine the past to be. That's a lovely problem, which has considerable importance in reality, because this past time is what you try to recapture as past time. And for instance, De Quincey has the symbolization in his Savannah del Mar that all time which is concerned is the past, which lies here as a underground or undersea city, and which has to be recaptured somehow, a nightmare. It is the past time. And you have a similar problem, not in the nightmare form, but still you have a problem like that in Proust's Recherche du temps perdu, the time that got lost. And that is the time in which you are occupied by. If you operate with such a conception of a life. Of course, then you can take another situation. You can assume that that this is a flow and you are in it. Then the flow would go past you. You would be a constant at some point. And then indeed, you would be in the stream, flowing with it into the future, which has another very interesting consequence, but we cannot go into all that here now. But you see, I just want to loosen up a bit your idea about time. It is not an easy matter, but you can use all sorts of symbolisms. You should be aware that you use symbolisms, why you use a symbolism, and the question, which is the proper symbolism to be used, can only be solved by analysis of reality and not just by talking about time. One has to analyze reality. So I am using here the flow of present conception, to which I shall have to come back then presently in detail. So that is the general position of history which I shall use here. Now, the title of these lectures is The Drama of Humanity. It is not about man, but about humanity. Now why? We are accustomed, for instance, to talk about the nature of man. And then you have usually the great fights between adherents of a classic philosophy, who will tell you that the nature of man is a constant, and between the apocalyptically excited intellectuals who tell you the nature of man changes, it will change even more in the future, and all our expectations for the future and for a new realm on this earth depend on changes in the nature of man. Now obviously you are here again in a logical problem, because if by nature of anything you mean the constant features can't change, because then they wouldn't be constant. So there is logically impossible. By definition, the nature can't change. But there is a real problem, nevertheless. And that real problem is present already at the time when the conception of a nature of man is formed in antiquity, in classical philosophy. That's where it's formed. And there arises the conception that man has a nature in the sense of a form like any object of sense perception. Like a table that is developed according to a plan, or like a plant which has obviously an organismic plan in its growth and so on. And that is a decisive point. You see, we are very close still in our English empiricism since the 18th century to the Aristotelian conception that a metaphysics of man has to be formulated in terms of form and matter. So, either the artifact or the organism is the model on which you philosophize. But it isn't really man. So if you transfer the model of a form and the matter organized by that form to the human person or to a society, you run into difficulties simply because society is neither an artifact nor an organism, but something entirely different. It is engaged in some sort of a process which is not the same as that of the model of artifact or organism. And you run therefore into the problem that there is a process of change in conflict with the assumed form. And one can only solve that problem by admitting that here is a difficulty, and the answer is, there is obviously enough of stable features in man to recognize him as a human being, and obviously enough of process in him in order to recognize that there is a process going on in him, and not only as an animal on the organic level, but also on the mental, intellectual, spiritual level. Such processes of the human soul, or whatever you wish to call it, where the process takes place, because it doesn't take place in the organism, but it is a mental or spiritual process, has produced its own adequate form of symbolization that is called autobiography. So wherever there is a consciousness of man in process, the problem of autobiography begins to develop as an interesting subject matter. Otherwise, you would simply have only a stolid type which never changes. But when you become aware of the change and of the importance of change, then autobiographical problems begin to present themselves. Also, already in antiquity, that's when autobiography begins. So, we have always a problem that on the one hand there are stable features in man, on the other hand there is a process going on, and especially the process of discovering that man has stable features, because man as a subject matter to be defined in any terms at all is not omnipresent in history, but it arises in Greek civilization with specific definitions of man, as for instance the animal rationale, the zoon nun echon in Greek, an animal that has mind or nous or reason, and such a definition is in itself an event in the history of mankind. Now one peculiarity of this event, as it happens in Greek philosophy, however, is that the result, a formulation of the nature of man in stable terms, such a definition as man is a rational animal, is resulting from it. But there is not included in this observation that the observation itself is a new event in history. Therefore you have then a peculiar structure of all classical philosophy of order. You have insights into the personal structure of man as a stable structure in a given situation of the late polis. That is, for instance, the typical content of Aristotelian ethics. The structure of man and the structure of his behavior, true behavior according to his nature in society and the world. Or you can then expand that picture of man as a perfect stable structure into a perfect stable structure of society as it ought to be. That is then the content of the paradigms of a best constitution in Aristotelian politics or in Platonic politics. But there is nowhere in the series of ethics and politics, which are after all the two volumes of a philosophy of order, a third volume which would have to be called historics, where one would go into the problem that such stable features as described in ethics and politics are discovered at a certain point in history in Plato and Aristotle, and why and what went before it, what possibly could come after. So the event character itself does not become thematic, but only the result. So this reflexive element, which is a process element in the nature of man, that would, if unfolded, contain the problem that the nature of man at any given time, so it has stable features, contains always a self-understanding of man at a given historical period in his relations to all other sectors of reality, the world, God, and society. So all these other relations are envisaged in a certain manner in which they were not envisaged before, and in a manner in which no longer we do envisage them today. So this element of envisaging the nature of man, understanding himself, developing these images of self-understanding, in addition to the results. So this picture of a specific humanity, not only the recognition of the structure of man, but of humanity in the sense of being man in a certain manner in relation to all other elements of reality. That is what I would like to call humanity, as distinguished from a stable nature of man. So that is what is meant by humanity. Now, that gives the leaders with a number of definitions with which I may conclude this section. That is to say, humanity means then man in a mode of understanding himself in his relation to God, world, and society. And these modes change. And history then would be the drama, if any meaning in it can be discovered, of humanity, of the self-understandings of man. So with that I want to leave all the introductory part, and I hope I have done my duties in that respect, and now can come to the subject matter of the 3 lectures. But that is already part of the 3rd lecture. Here we have to deal now with first the plan of the lectures. I shall develop only that for the first lecture and mention the others. The three titles for the 3 lectures are Man in the Cosmos, The Epiphany of Man, and Man in Revolt. I shall now give only, again in diagrammatical form, because that sometimes is more persuasive than any other elaborate declaration, the relation of these 3 topics to one another. If you take on the level of the cosmic experience some nice pudding like that, as including all the realities, such as man, God, heaven, earth, society, and God knows what, with an order in it. A sort of ordered community of partners in this whole globe of reality. When then, in this globe of reality, there springs up the element of consciousness in man, to the level of self-consciousness, you would get here a sort of smaller globe in it, representing the consciousness of man, in which he is conscious of being in relation to his divine ground of existence. That is the actual content of consciousness when it appears. Now that would be an event within cosmic reality, the differentiation of consciousness. Now it is possible, of course, to isolate that consciousness against the rest of the cosmic reality in which it has arisen. Then you would have here now a second such globe containing only this part here, with this tangent, in which there is nothing but God is a transcendent pole and man is an immanent pole, and all the rest of reality is forgotten. That is a possibility, which actually happens. And then you can go on and forget, for instance, about the transcendent pole. Man rarely forgets about himself. And then there is nothing left but here a sort of decapitated immanence. And that is about the situation of contemporary conception of man. So, to take one sector of reality out of the larger reality, isolate it against the whole cosmic reality, call that the reality of philosophy or revelation, and then you cut that in half, decapitate the transcendent part, and you are left then with the lower part, with the immanent reality. So this first part, the first diagram, would be man in the cosmos. The second part, in isolation, the epiphany of man, the differentiation of the consciousness out of the general reality of the cosmos, and then the breaking in two, the snapping of this tangent here to the divine ground, and man in revolt would be the third topic. So that is, of course, a very rough draft, but you will see that it is not too far off the truth. So that is about what I want to say about the organization of the lectures. Now, for the first lecture. It will be about man and the cosmos, and there we have to deal with the primary experience of the cosmos represented by that first nice round pudding there. In that reality, the historical site are the ancient civilizations, especially the civilizations of Egypt, Sumer, and Babylon. Now for terminology, let's be clear about it. The term cosmos, by which we have to refer to this type of experience, I shall explain what it is later, is a late Greek term. It is not a term which appears in the ancient Oriental civilizations themselves. in these original cosmological civilizations to which I have just referred, there is no comprehensive term for the cosmos. But there we talk only about the realities concretely that we have there. So for instance, about heaven and earth. So that even when you then get into the prophetic period, the best you can predict is a new heaven and a new earth. Sometimes translated as a new world or a new cosmos. But that is the original cosmological reality. A heaven and an earth. The heaven you can see, the earth you can see. No speculative concept here. Or the gods, man and society. Or within society, a ruler, the king, and the people. So these are the terms in which in the literary text of cosmological civilizations one talks about reality. A term for the cosmos does not appear. There's only a term for the order of this community of partners in some sort of community for which there is no term except the later Greek term cosmos. Especially I want to draw your attention to the problem that the gods are intracosmic. There is no such thing as a world transcendent God in any cosmological civilization. And very long even then in revelation and philosophy, there is no world transcendent God. That's a very peculiar problem, how that problem arises at all. But in the cosmological civilizations, the gods are intracosmic, part of the cosmos. With that in mind now, let me say a word about the expressive forms, the symbolizations in which such an idea is, such an experience is expressed. It is usually called the myth. And here we are still in a considerable methodological quandary in the practice of science, because the comparative religionists and mythologists and archaeologists usually subscribe still to the older conceptions of myth, which are rooted in the general phenomenology of religion. That is, they are fundamentalist. One takes the phenomenon of a symbol and does not go back to the experience that has produced it. Therefore, if you take the myth as a symbolic, as a phenomenon of a symbol, you arrive then at such a definition of the myth as you find, for instance, in Iliad's myth and reality. Let me read that to you, because then you will see easiest what the new problem is. Iliad defines myth. Myth narrates a sacred history, relates an event that took place in primordial times, the fabled time of the beginnings. In other words, myth tells how, through the deeds of supernatural beings, a reality came into existence, be it the whole of reality, the cosmos, or only a fragment of reality. An island, a species, a plant, a particular kind of human behavior, an institution. Myth then is always an account of a creation. It relates how something was produced, began to be. Now, against this very much accepted definition of myth, I would make the following exemptions. In the first place, when you go strictly empirically at the materials, literary documents of a cosmological civilization, the Egyptian, Sumerian, the Babylonian, the Assyrian, or even an Hindu, anything, only a very small percentage of all the materials are stories of anything. But when you have to deal, for instance, with the tension between a ruler and the gods, or a ruler and the people, or with the invasion, say, of the Hyksos, I've come back to this example in Egypt, no stories of the gods will tell you anything, but there are quite different forms of expression than stories. So the formulation, myth then is always an account of creation, is flatly wrong in the face of the empirical facts. There are quite other types of myths than that. The second point is that the gods are designated as supernatural beings. That is, of course, impermissible. Then, the term supernatural as opposed to natural is a scholastic terminology very strongly used by Thomas Aquinas, and from scholasticism as part of dogma, it has entered into the dogmatism of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and Eliade is rather an Enlightenment ideologue in this respect and a scholastic. In that connection, we speak of supernatural as opposed to natural. As I just indicated, no man living in a cosmological civilization ever knew that the gods were a supernature as against the nature. But there were heaven and earth and the gods and man and the king, and all was part of this partnership. Nothing in it was more natural than anything else. So the term nature and supernature just makes no sense, it is anachronistically when used with regard to a cosmological civilization. That makes sense in the 13th century of scholasticism, that makes sense in Enlightenment under the influence of natural science, but it makes no sense whatsoever when you deal with an ancient civilization. So for that reason, one cannot accept these nominalistic definitions, and you have to take a realistic definition which is very much simpler. You can then simply say, myth is that body of symbols which had in fact been found adequate by the members of such civilizations for expressing their experiences of the cosmos in which they lived. Nobody can object against that. You simply go back to the empirical facts. And now, let me make good that what I said. In the myth, you have a lot of things which are not story. For instance, I've listed here 9 different types. Let me just enumerate them. 2 of them I shall then deal with examples. We have symbolizations of the established order of empire. The empire is an analogon of the cosmos. You might call it the small cosmos, the cosmion. Such formulations of the analogy between empire structure and cosmic structure are, for instance, to be found in the famous preamble to the Codex Hammurabi. No story of it. Parallel structure between the heavens and the earth. The parallel, the small cosmos. Then, a case in which you have history, but a history of a very peculiar kind. A foundation myth of empire. So the established myth is symbolized by the parallel, the analogy. A foundation myth must be symbolized by an action among the gods. The form is not a history strictly, but a drama, such as the theology of Memphis of probably 3000 BC. So a drama which tells the story of the foundation of Egypt as a drama enacted among the gods of Egypt. Then, in the crisis periods, as for instance the first intermediate period, in the about 2200 to 2000 was the height of that crisis in Egypt, you find highly intricate discussion of the contemporary skeptical arguments with an existential analysis of true existence leading out of this mess. We'll come back to that. Or, you have lyrics expressing skepticism in the gods. Not being a story of the gods at all, but expressing skepticism of man with regard to the stories told about the gods. As for instance, the Song of the Harper. Songs of skeptics. Then, a vast body is roughly an equivalent to what you would find on the ordinary level of common sense in the 18th century sense. The wisdom literature. Nothing about the gods, only about man, but in the context of a cosmological experience. Then, the great expressions of defeat, victory, restoration of empire. No story at all. Relation between the ruler and God. That is the problem. Then, the ritual renewals of order in the New Year festivals. What Eliade usually brings under the éternel retour, the eternal return. There is no eternal return in any ancient civilizations. There's only a rhythmical renewal. And the rhythm is not an eternal return. Let me briefly explain it because there's still a lot of misunderstanding about it. When you have a rhythmical renewal, you have something like a sinus curve. like the annual spring, summer, fall and winter, going on and on. But then there is something like a return, eternal return of the same, and that would be really a circle of events in which, as Aristotle does in the Problemata, asks the question, if I'm living here at a point in the present, that be my present, and then I have an historical event like the war against Troy, then I can ask myself the question, which way am I nearer to the war against Troy? This way going backward, or this way going forward? That would be eternal return. But such an eternal return as an historical conception is nowhere to be found before the 7th century BC, in Hinduism and in Hellas. No ancient civilization had ever any conception of an eternal return, but only the rhythmical renewal. Well, that was not a story either, but the question of ritual renewal. Then, something else which properly does not come under much in the sense of a story of the gods at all. That is the construction of unilinear history from the beginning of the creation of the world down to the present imperial presence, the empire. We have, which is also very little known, unilinear history in ancient civilization. But we have no cyclical history. There's no concept of cyclical time or cyclical history in the ancient civilizations of the cosmological time. But there is unilinear history. I shall come back to that in the second lecture. And then we have all sorts of symptoms of a breakthrough beyond cosmic experience in the direction of either a beginning in time, that would be this dimension here, extrapolation into the past to the point of origin, or to find the origin in transcendence here. So we have speculative extrapolation of a known part of history, say this part, extrapolating it back to a beginning. This is one way of it. Or turns directed without benefit of other parts of reality to an unknown God beyond all the known gods. So the problem of the unknown God is a problem already in Egyptian civilization, and the main god of the later period, Ammon, the Egyptian word Ammon means the hidden one. So the hidden god, which then becomes very virulent in Gnosticism, is already present in the Ammon hymns at the latest in the 8th century BC. So here you have all sorts of literature and symbolic expressions which are all would lump as myths, and of which only a small part has the character of a story. As you have seen from the enumeration already, also, all human problems and situations with which we are familiar, question of loss of existence, questions of alienation, of crisis, of empire, of personal crisis and so on, all are subject matter of expression in a peculiar medium. So not only just one block-like peculiar conception of this or that. And I want now to give you one or two examples of what that looks like in times of crisis, what really expression in the medium of cosmological civilization is what it looks like if it is not a story. And I want to give two examples. One example, perhaps I can do that still today, from the point of view of the ruler, and one example from the point of view of the common man. Now, from the point of view of the ruler, there is preserved a very interesting, we have no term for that, a declaration of the only female pharaoh, the Queen Hatshepsut, 1501 to 1480 before Christ, on occasion of the restoration of order after the expulsion of the nomad invaders, the Hyksos. Let me read you that information of the queen to the people. Hear all ye people and folk, as many as they may be. I have done these things through the counsel of my heart. Colon. Now she tells what he thinks. I have not forgetfully slept, but have restored what had been ruined. I have raised up what had gone to pieces. When the Asiatics were in the midst of Avaris in the Northland, the Hyksos, and among them were nomads, overthrowing what had been made. They ruled without Re, the Egyptian god, and he, Re, did not act through divine command down to my majesty. That was the crisis. Now comes the result of restoration. I am established on the thrones of Re. I was foretold for the limits of the years as the one born to conquer. I am come as the Ureus serpent of Horus, flaming against my enemies. I have made distant those whom the gods abominate, and earth has carried off their footprints. That was the restoration. And now the interpretation. This is the command of the father of my fathers, who comes at his appointed times of Re, the sun god. And there shall not occur damage to what Ammon Re has commanded. My own command endures like the mountains. The sun disk shines forth and spreads rays over the titles of my majesty, and my falcon is high above my name standard for the duration of eternity. Now here you see what a so-called mystical expression is. Here speaks a ruler after the Hyksos have been expelled from the country. And now comes in two, always in pairs, first, the achievement of the queen. She has restored what had been ruined. And the characterization of ruin is they ruled, these invaders, the chaotic invaders, without the sun god. So there is rule without proper rule. And God did not act through divine command down to my majesty. That is, the order is mediated through the Pharaoh from the gods. And the gods did not let the order flow from himself through the Pharaoh down to the empire of the people living in it. So that is the definition of disorder. Now when it is re-established, then the Pharaoh is again the mediator of divine order to the people, thanks to the God. And then comes, in the second part, again opposed to one another, this is the command of the Father, and my own command endures like the mountains. Always a parallel between the king and the God and the king and the order. The term for order, by the way, in Egypt is ma'at. So that goes all through the order. The ma'at is dispensed from the gods down through the Pharaoh to the empires, administrators, and the people. So when that cause is interrupted, then there is disorder. So you may call it a story, I don't know if you think it is a story, but it is a description of the dynamics of order in terms of the relation between the God, the king, the people, and the invaders. So here is trouble. Now in this kind of trouble, you then have also the commoners bitterly suffering from it. All of that. Can you stick it out another quarter of an hour? In the famous dispute of a man who wants to commit suicide with his soul. So that is not a Pharaoh but a commoner. He wants to commit suicide if there is his order, because he doesn't like to live in that sort of environment. And from this I want just to give a few examples of description. I cannot give the whole analysis, but because time is too far advanced, but at least a few examples. He describes the disordered social world in which he lives. Now look at the formulation. They are always given in tristichs, in which the first line is repeated. He says, for instance, to whom can I speak today? One's fellows are evil. The friends of today do not love. If you translate it into classical philosophy or Christian terminology, it means that the classical philia politica, or the love among men in confidence, has disappeared when the order emanating from the gods is gone. Everything has become a man alone for himself and has become evil, therefore. Very drastically, this loneliness and the loss of character is described in the following treatise. To whom can I speak today? Faces have disappeared. Every man has a downcast face towards his fellows. Like a modern urbanized society, you might say, Riesmann's lonely crowd or such parallels emerge immediately. Or, to whom can I speak today? There is no one contented of heart. The man with whom one went no longer exists. So the dissolution of society, destruction, disappearance of contentment, the phenomenon of alienation makes itself felt. That is a description of the society when there is disorder. And then, how is that to be interpreted? When there is such disorder, man turns away from a life that has become senseless and contemplates suicide. Let me give you at least two of these suicide risks. Death faces me today like the recovery of a sick man, like going out into the open after a confinement. Death faces me today like the longing of a man to see his home again after many years that he was held in captivity. And so he goes on and on. All the metaphors of escape from this reality as a release from sickness, a release from prison, a release from a darkness that makes you see the light, and so on. And returning to a sort of home now. And then what should be the result of such escape from this senseless reality? A sort of judgment in the beyond. In the last group of these statistics, he says, why surely he who is yonder will be a living God, punishing the sin of him who commits it. Why surely he who is yonder will stand at the back of the sun, causing the choices therein to be given to the temples. Why surely he who is yonder will be a man of wisdom, not hindered from appealing to Re when he speaks. A sort of conception of a judgment in the beyond, in which man can participate because he is immortal, when he commits suicide in order to escape a world in which he is completely alienated, which has become strange to him, and against which death is then the real life. Very similar to the formulation which you find in Plato's Gorgias, for instance. Now, here you have an almost complete analysis of a deficient existence in society when the ma'at, the order, has disappeared, of a recovery of a truth of existence in the sense of the divine order which is necessary. But in this particular situation, a despair that through any sort of social action it could be achieved, and that therefore the only sense, a meaningful course of action would be suicide that would bring man in his immortality into the company of the sun god and there reinforce his ordering power again for the world, for the restoration of the empire of Egypt. Now that is under Egyptian conditions, of course, a revolutionary conception, because under the empire conception, only the pharaoh is the mediator of divine order. A single Egyptian can do nothing about it. He can only create disorder. When here now appears a single man who by way of suicide becomes a living god like the pharaoh in the bark of the sun god, he places himself in the place of the pharaoh. So the center of order is understood to be man, not the ruler, the ultimate center of order. And this existential insight that the order is man and not in the social organization only the pharaoh is absolutely present here. But it cannot crystallize into, or under other conditions it might become, a revolutionary movement, or a prophet who could assemble a sect around himself, or a philosopher who could found an academy or anything like that. Because all that is under Egyptian conditions yet impossible. The empire, in the cosmological sense, is so strongly institutionalized that if you have not status on the administrative level, on the priestly level of the temples and so on, you are nobody with regard to the order of the empire among the living. You would have to join the dead in the bark of the sun god in order to count for something. And that is why suicide becomes a problem. If that is no longer, if the empire institutions are no longer so strongly alive that they are an absolute block to individual activity, then only you get into the problem of revolutionary action through new intellectual or other spiritual movements with the center of a personality, a prophet or something like that. So that is not yet possible in the Egyptian consciousness. So let me close there with, and the next time we come then to the epiphany of man, when just such things become possible. How that can be done. Thank you very much.